So colleagues, welcome back if you've gone to buy another Mike Rosen book or if you've just needed a breather. In this half an hour conversation, welcome Michael Stevenson. It's lovely to have you with us. We're going to focus even more deeply on some of the threads of the last conversation, and we're going to look at the concept of human flourishing. What is it? How might we think about it? How might we nurture it, cultivate it? Might we? How might we assess, or I would prefer maybe evidence, progress in it? That's interesting, that assessment word conversation that, Michael, if you go back to Latin, it's assidere, sitting beside, so it's more of a coaching model. But before I do that, let me just tell you a few things about Michael and then invite him to give us the real story. Michael, I think I've had the privilege of knowing you for about 20 years, but especially in the last 5 years, watching you introduce the creative thinking assessment, the first ever for PISA. I know that you've worked for the BBC, worked for Cisco Systems, helped to create the Global Education Forum. You've done so many things, led the innovative assessment strand at the OECD, and I believe you've now got a couple of new roles, one at Wellington and one with the IB. That was a very imperfect sentence. Can you tell us a little more and flesh out who you are, Michael, and how you've got to where you've got to?
Thank you, Bill, and lovely to see you all and to be here today. Yes, I began at the BBC, as people did, well on 40 years ago, less so now, and made my way through programme production, really, to education and factual and learning, and having failed to persuade the BBC's governors that if education was one of the original verities of the BBC alongside entertainment and information, wasn't it time that somebody knew about that? Having failed to persuade them of that, I went on into the great wide world of education. 3 not particularly cheerful years in the Department for Education here as strategy director, but it was a useful learning experience. Silicon Valley, thinking about innovative education and how technology could help, and then latterly the OECD. So one of these days I'll actually go and work in a school rather than pontificate about them, but the OECD realized as long ago as 10 years ago that a global assessment, summative, of math, science and reading, plus some innovation, surely couldn't go on forever. And there were broader things that could be thought about in terms of what young people might learn, and other ways of thinking how they might be evidenced, those things. And that central question, do we want to go on having global competitions between countries about whose 15-year-olds are best? So that was the 10-year canvas on which I've worked at the OECD, latterly realizing that you wouldn't get that sort of change to PISA unless you came up the value chain and asked what the purpose of education really are, and worked with not the heads of evaluation agencies in 80 countries, but the most senior civil servants, the permanent secretaries, the director generals of schools. So that's what led Bill to the Education for Human Flourishing framework published by the OECD last November.
Thank you. And I think you've also got a role at Wellington. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I keep a back foot in the OECD, so I continue to lead those intergovernmental conversations. The countries who came up with the framework, Finland, Estonia, Canada, Singapore, Australia, Germany, and the UK. But in addition, we founded an Institute of Human Flourishing at Wellington to see whether we could actually make education for human flourishing work for 1,400 young people, albeit in a privileged setting, but with state school partners. And then more recently, I've become senior advisor to the IB that also wants to be the human flourishing organization. And then again, it's a question of how can it direct all of its thinking, offers and services in this in this direction. Yeah.
Wonderful. We've had lots of different synonyms for flourishing, whether it's self-esteem or well-being or even happiness. Could you tell us what you think flourishing is, and tell us just a little bit about the framework? I did end my presentation this morning with the graphic from your framework, but I don't think they were listening at that stage because they'd had enough of me.
Well, the qualification is probably do as I say, not as I do. I'm not sure just how flourishing I am, or any of us are. But anyway, here's the thinking. And again, I don't know who Andrew is, but it's Aristotelian, but a bit of Buddhism and Confucianism and Ubuntu thrown in. So a strong focus on those dimensions of human flourishing, happiness, meaning, relationships, accomplishment, whatever you take accomplishment to be. It's not just an exam certificate, clearly. And the OECD's work, maybe because of that kind of PISA lens, has been very much focused on individual flourishing. You don't have to go far into Eastern traditions, and actually, to be fair to Aristotle, you have to go very far into Aristotle himself to see the collective dimensions of flourishing, families, communities, societies, the planet, lives as yet unlived. So I think the most helpful thing to do in reorienting the purposes of education is to focus on the broadly agreed and intuitive dimensions of human flourishing. And that's what allows you to realign from foundational literacies, math, science, and reading forever, towards more inspiring and broader competencies. Which competencies? The OECD work focuses on 5. 3 of them are strongly oriented around meaning, and the other 2 are, to some extent, enabling. Perhaps the principal one is acting in the world, finding your intent, your purpose, shaping your activities, but counting what you do in terms of its impact on a better world. Maybe the second meaning-making competency to draw out is understanding the world. That could be about recognizing and reconciling competing worldviews. It could be coming to terms with complex systems. But in our world of misinformation and social media silos, it's surely something we need to do. And the third meaning-making competency is appreciating the world, giving a much greater place to beauty, the capacity to draw beauty into yourself, ask how you frame the world, how might you frame the world. And for some, though not for the OECD, which after all is based in Paris, in France, beauty is a gateway into spirituality and faith. They have a lot of saints' days in Paris, but they don't do spirituality, it turns out. And then 2 enabling competencies, which I think are a bit closer to home. Adaptive problem solving. I suppose the adaptive bit is when you confront a problem that is novel, maybe unique. How do you draw on every problem you ever solved in order to solve this one? It's what experts do. And then, finally, ethical competency, which was developed on behalf of the OECD by the Estonians at the University of Tartu. Everything from recognizing the ethical dimension of an issue all the way through to judgment, decision-making, and acting. So that is a kind of star or quintet of competencies. And if you like, you could say that in the middle of those competencies stand some questions. And above all, who am I? And what am I for? Meaning and agency, which seem to me to be totally central to that Aristotelian and broader sense of flourishing.
So if we ask those same kinds of questions about what the point of school is for, how would a flourishing school, or how might a flourishing school look different from many schools now, in each of those, I think, 8 different jurisdictions?
Well, many schools would recognize the things that I'm talking about, and it's the oldest trick in the book to say we're already doing it. See, I've come to recognize and to dread that phrase. But they'd be right. But the question is it marginal or is it central? Is it enriching or is it the very core? The OECD work locates those 5 flourishing competencies in an education architecture. Well, it's a pyramid, really. So the top of the pyramid has got those human flourishing dimensions in it. Happiness, meaning, relationships, accomplishment. And the competencies run through the middle. And if you became expert in the competencies, you'd have a fighting chance of achieving those dimensions of flourishing. But the critical thing in the architecture is the foundation. By putting a foundation in place on which those competencies are built, we achieve the trick of uniting forward-looking jurisdictions like Finland with more conservative jurisdictions like this one. Because into that foundation goes the foundational literacies, maths, science and reading, the subject-based curriculum, social and emotional skills, maybe the well-being factors. So you're able to say that the competences are not instead, but they build upon. However, they are the centerpiece of that pyramid. They are the core, not nudging for a look in from the margins.
Yes. I think you said the UK. Is it UK or is it England that are part of the group?
It sort of depends on which day you ask the permanent secretary, but I think the honest answer is England, okay. Since the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish teams did not get an invite from her to these discussions. But the British Permanent Secretary played a key role in these policy discussions over a 3-year period, contributed to them, demanded rigour, but didn't choose to put the ideas forward in the context of the recent policy review, curriculum review.
This may seem a mischievous question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. By the way, we have colleagues from Wales and Scotland in the room. That's partly why I was clarifying it. But that list of the other countries, they're quite different from the way we've chosen to focus on the answer to the question, what's the point of school, and what values, and what do we measure? Was that a conscious decision on your part, or
no.
How did that come about?
I mean, it's true, but no, it wasn't conscious. These countries were designated by the OECD as high-performing systems. It wasn't massively scientific, but all 7 of those jurisdictions achieve above OECD average in each of the core domains of PISA, and are okay, though not necessarily brilliant, at closing equity gaps. Okay. 4 are small but beautiful. British Columbia in Canada, Singapore, Finland, and Estonia. I mean, Estonia, top in Europe, is only 1.3 million people. 3 sort of OECD powerhouses who met the qualifications and are larger economies, the UK, Germany, and Australia. All 3 of those bigger countries would take a more small c conservative view of the purposes of education. Only 10 days ago, the Finns published a major report on the future purposes of education after 2 years in which they stayed on track with the OECD work, and that's their own education for human flourishing vision. So yeah, there was a fissure between those 2 groups, but enough to hold them together.
So should we expect a white paper on human flourishing?
In this country?
Yes.
Well,
you and I... A green paper,
yeah.
even.
You and I are both getting on in our lives, Bill, but we'd have to survive quite a lot longer before being confident, I think, of that.
Thank you. At the school level, you were beautifully self-deprecating early on about saying your life is not in schools, it's in the bigger organisations. But if you could take yourself to a school, what would or what might change in terms of pedagogy if you were set on developing a flourishing group of staff and students in your institution?
Well, we're having a go at this at Wellington. The Wellington experiment, proof of concept is a fairer word, is an initiative that I share with Anthony Selden, who's gone back to Wellington to sort of be group CEO of Wellington and its 8 sister international schools in South Asia. And the idea is that we put those 5 competencies at the heart of the learning experience of those students. As I say, from age 3 to age 18, 19, trying to get to that point over a 2-year period, one could say that's what we're doing. Taking advantage of a couple of spaces in the child's life, arguably Key Stage 3, arguably the IB diploma for that group of older children who do it, where you could actually build around the 5 competencies. So the question arises, how do you equip the staff and leaders for that then? The OECD framework asked NIE in Singapore to think about learning environments and pedagogies. And they came up with a kind of formula, which I'm not entirely wedded to, but I think it's very interesting, which is kind of direct instruction plus experiential learning in all its guises gives action-oriented learning. And I suppose they were feeling that action-oriented learning was probably the absolute key to these competencies. I would imagine it is more to adaptive problem solving than the others, but anyway. Wellington is having a think about that, but is also very interested, of course, in how you take advantage of the different dimensions of a school like Wellington. So the academic curriculum, but the co-curriculum, enrichment, and life in houses, boarding school. How do you push all of that? How do you integrate all of that to equip young people with the competencies? And it's interested in what will be familiar to all of you, and probably more to you than to me, but a kind of spectrum from direct instruction through, aspects of coaching, mentoring, non-directive learning, with each teacher thinking about which aspect of the spectrum they draw on for which dimension of the learning experience for the child in order to create a totally integrated pedagogy. I don't know whether that will work, but I'm very interested to find out.
Yeah, great. And I guess this is a conference primarily focusing on assessment. Of your 5 competencies, do you imagine them being assessed summatively, assessed formatively, a mixture of the above, some in, some out, as we were just having that interesting discussion just now? How do you think that might play out?
Yeah, I think not one size fits all, which is a big thing for someone to say from a PISA background. The OECD framework took a sort of principled view that assessment should be useful. I think I heard Ollie talking about it being personalized and multimodal and formative. Integrated in the sense that with digital learning, wonderful if you can take the data off live rather than push kids into exam halls. And that word, rigorous, but principled assessment design. You don't get your bonus at the OECD for dropping the word rigor. Though you can give it to charity if you like. Now that those competencies are going through a kind of PISA lens, and very talented colleagues in Paris are thinking about how we could bring these competencies and those assessment principles into a reconceptualized PISA. Reconceptualized in terms of what you'd assess and how you'd assess it. Wellington is equally interested in the qualitative as in the quantitative. We're very interested in developing a sort of reflective process with young people, guided by teachers as they think through their ability, their progress in nurturing these competencies. But at the same time, you know, since each of these competencies can be broken down into knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, and you can locate or map those knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values in traditional subjects, you can actually see how far assessment performance of a quantitative sort in this or that subject is actually building up a capacity in the individual child in the competencies. We'll see how far that goes. The IB is also interested, as you may know, Bill, in how it moves forward assessment of all kinds, but in particular, I think complex competencies like these, and its work with Melbourne is about, you know, a rigorous, validated process for transferable learning competencies aligned with the IB learner profile and those 10 characteristics. Yeah. So those are three lenses, PISA, Wellington, IB, on this kind of stuff, but I hope suggesting that we are broadening out, not narrowing down as we take this journey.
Sure. We had Sandra Milligan earlier on today, and she was great. She was talking about schools as first movers, where they're really taking the lead in this, which is a lovely expression. Throughout the day, we've talked about strength-based assessment, digital learner profiles, the potential for AI, digital badging, lots of work focusing on rigorous project work and inquiry-based learning, beginning to question whether or not we need demonstrations of your ability to act in different contexts, thinking about whether we can do this continuously rather than just as an event, so it could be more of a process just in time. You go all over the world. Who's doing these kind of things best, Michael, that you've come across? Which jurisdictions? Can you give us just a sense of optimism, of the positive deviance that you've found or you know of that we could learn from?
Wherever you go and find this sort of thing, I'd still put it under your label deviance as opposed to mainstream. But the deviance is bubbling up everywhere and is bursting through. And in some sense, the weight is shifting from policymakers to practitioners in the great global game of education change. It's quite hard to evidence that, but it's palpable, I think. So I see it bubbling through, certainly in Finland, though they're the first to say that they never really cracked cross-cutting competencies, either teaching them or assessing them. I see it bubbling through in Estonia, even though some of their very best schools, I imagine, still look like a great northern grammar school from the 1950s. It's amazing how these things can coexist in one small country. I think British Columbia is pretty bold. You certainly have seen that from the period, from the early years of this century. I think they got pulled back by rather technocratic policymakers. It wasn't a political thing. They just couldn't see how it worked. They kept talking, you know, the Deputy Minister of Schools in British Columbia kept talking about how he'd lost line of sight to the classroom. I don't trust them, was the undertow. So he pulled all of that back for 3 or 4 years, but it's come right back again under more far-sighted policymakers. So I do see more than green shoots. I do see a real push for new forms of evidencing and assessing, but the global policy conversation is still on a knife edge. And though it's true that when the high-performing systems took this a new approach to purposes and policies and competencies to the PISA Governing Board in Istanbul last May, every single country said, we'd like this work to move forward. What I think I've seen over the last 8 or 9 months is quite a lot of those countries, particularly sort of middle rankers, OECD, sort of scratching their chins and saying, well, are we sure? We'd really rather have our cake and eat it. Maybe these competencies are great, but we don't yet know that they'll work, which is, you know, the last redoubt of education policymakers. It may be the right thing, but does it work? And they're saying, for goodness sake, let's hang on to what we know, which is maths, science, and reading. Of course, you know, the whole project is absolutely about, as I said, building on maths, science, and reading, not slinging it out. But I do feel that the conversation is at a knife edge, partly because, if I can put it this way, in a world which in so many senses is going backwards, what is it about education that would suddenly allow it to move forward against all odds towards human flourishing? I think there's a sense amongst those who are watching this that can't quite believe that this conversation's happening in a world where you've only got to switch on the television at night and see the latest horror. So can't be sure that it's going to move forward, but every day makes me a little more confident.
Last question, if I might. You started by reminding us that much of this is at the individual level, when we know a lot about human flourishing being collective, being your friendship and other groups, your sense of meaning and purpose in life. Most of assessment is individually oriented. How can we change the culture so that it's not just in the drama studio or on the sports field, that we get a genuine sense of collaboration being valuable and valued?
Yeah. Well, I've certainly found a huge emphasis on the collective flourishing in my new work at the IB. You know, they would say that it's all about equitable and sustainable communities where we live within the limits of the planet. And that's the kind of outer concentric circle, and these inner dimensions, like meaning through to accomplishment, are the core of the circle, the inner circle. And I find that pretty compelling. If you think about the inner development goals, which I think are a very interesting parallel to the OECD flourishing competencies, there's being, there's thinking, there's relating, there's acting, and there's collaborating. And I'm not sure about that, but I'd rather say being with, relating obviously captures the withness, acting with, and thinking with, so that the whole direction of competency and development is collaborative. I can see what that means in terms of what we learn, and to some extent how we learn. I'm much less clear in my own head, but I'm sure you're clearer, Bill, and many people in this room, what we mean by the assessment of collective competency or capacity, and how we would actually put that in place. But
on which moment I'm going to say that's another conference. The assessment of collective competence. Michael, thank you so much for giving us your time. Would you please, colleagues, put your hands together and thank Michael Stevenson. Thank you.